Hi, like and subscribe for the more true, scary stories. Story 1.
I grew up in a family that always struggled with money. I wish I could say we made the best of our situation, but that would be the worst kind of lie, the kind that lets my father off the hook. He was a destructive, overbearing force in our lives, and he had a temper that made our house feel like we were living with a sleeping bear that no one dared poke. My mother, sweet and caring as she was to me, and my sister Addie, was no match for him. She barely managed to hold on to the light in her eyes, and it faded year to year. The worst part of my father, thinking back, was always the time just before the yelling. It was the look on his face, that expression that meant he was about to start shouting and throwing things. It wasn't what you'd think it might be, a flash of angry fire in the eyes. No. It was just the slightest hint of a smile that told me he enjoyed being the monster. As rough as life was, growing up with a little sister meant I couldn't let myself sit around and wallow in misery. I may have only been 3 years older than she was, but I felt fully responsible for her. It was my job to protect her, most of all from my father, who for some reason picked at Addie more than he did the rest of us. Maybe it was her trusting nature, her innocence. Leave it to my father to see kindness as a weakness. Almost daily he would find something to yell at her for, and since I wouldn't dare defend her or yell back, I started acting out. I would do things that pulled his attention away from her and put it on me. I was a good kid once, a well-behaved kid. But for Addie, to protect her the way an older brother should, I didn't just seek out trouble, I became it. I did anything and everything I could think of to upset and disappoint my father. It made him so angry, in fact, that he practically forgot Addie existed. He spent so much time screaming at me for this thing or that, he hardly said a word to her. For most parents to forget a child would be neglect, but coming from my father, it was the opposite. The more he ignored her, the better she did. For every spanking I took, Addie read a book. Every hour I spent in detention, every ride home I received from the truant officer, she had time to breathe and grow. I lied and cheated and stole for her. It wasn't much, but it was dishonest work. Away from my father's blinding spotlight, Addie flourished. One summer, though, the year Addie turned 8, that all changed. And for once, it wasn't my father's fault. It was a particularly hot Friday night. My parents were watching one of the documentaries my father liked so much, something about dictators. I was reading comics under the covers after being sent to bed early. Writing on the wall at church, I believe, was my crime, when the most awful scream I'd ever heard broke the quiet. It was so brutal and almost inhuman shrieking that it took a few seconds to register who was making the sound. Addie. I burst from my makeshift tent and tore out of my room so fast I nearly pulled my arm out of its socket on the doorframe. My parents were already ahead of me, crowded around Addie's bed at the end of the hall. For a second I thought it was my father making Addie scream like that, and in that second, no matter what consequences would follow, I was prepared to pound my fist into the side of his head to get him away from her. It probably would have been the last thing I ever did, but it would have been worth it. Except it wasn't my father doing it. He and my mother were actually trying to get Addie to stop screaming, both of them shaking her arms and asking her what happened. It sounded as if she'd had a nightmare, but she was speaking so fast and with so little breath that I could barely make out a word of what she was saying. The only thing I could tell for sure was that she was looking at her window, with an expression on her face like she was looking at hell itself. I tried asking her what had happened, but my father only shouted for me to get back to bed. My mother, pale and thin in her nightgown, led me back down the hallway to my room. She assured me that Addie had just had a bad dream, and everything was going to be fine. Before she left to return to Addie's room, she gave me a kiss on my forehead, the way she did when my father wasn't looking. It was the first time in a long time I'd seen my mother without the long sleeves she always wore. As she leaned in, I saw a small collection of bruises on her arms and shoulders. Some were old and gray, some fresher, thumbprints painted in purple and yellow. She must have noticed me looking, because her eyes went wide, and then she closed my door and hurried away, back down the hollow hallway. I stood in front of that door for nearly an hour, feeling the throbbing in my arm, listening to my parents calm Addie down, trying to convince her that bad dreams couldn't hurt her. And over, Addie told my parents that she hadn't been sleeping, that she hadn't been dreaming. The next morning, I snuck into Addie's room early, before my parents came out of their room, to ask her what had happened to make her scream like that. But she was already gone. Her pajamas were folded and neatly stacked on her dresser. Her sneakers were gone. Even her bed was made, creased the way my father expected us to every morning. Only one thing was different from how she usually left her room. The shades on the windows weren't pulled up, leaving the usually bright pink room a dull, flesh-colored hue. It wasn't like Addie to leave her room so dark, and it reminded me how she'd stared at the window with that terrible look on her face. In the kitchen, I found my mother at the table. She quietly stirred a cup of coffee, staring at a spot on the wall. She looked like she hadn't slept, especially when she tried to smile at me, but came up empty, her eyes heavy with purple skin. I tried not to think of what else I'd seen, the secret she hid under those long sleeves. "Where's Addie?" I asked. She moved to the refrigerator to retrieve a carton of eggs, glancing at me, almost surprised by the question, as if she expected me to just forget everything from the night before. "Your sister isn't well," my mother said carefully. I know. She was scared of something. The stove clicked on with a hard snap. My mother paused a moment, picking her words. "Travis, sometimes, when people are under a lot of stress, they can make up things that aren't really there." "Addie's not a liar," I said, angry. "No, not lies. It's more like seeing things. Things you swear are real, but can't possibly be." "Where's Addie?" I repeated over the sound of sizzling oil. She took a breath. "Your father thought it would be best if she saw a doctor." My skin heated up faster than the pan on the stovetop. "Addie doesn't need a doctor. She needs help," I said, then added, "We all do." My mother spun, closing the distance between us in a second. She raised her hand so quickly, I thought she was about to hit me. I flinched, but she was only raising her finger at me, pushing it in my face. "Don't you dare let him hear you say that!" she hissed, looking like a cornered animal lashing out. Tears jumped to her eyes as she caught her hand and lowered it. Before she did, though, I caught sight of another bruise, a new one, just below the wrist. She alone knew how many there really were, except for maybe God, if he'd bothered to check in. My mouth opened, an apology trying its best to bubble up from my throat, but I couldn't get it out. The moment passed. My mother wiped her face and returned to the stove as if none of it had happened. It was a skill she'd been practicing for years, avoidance and denial, the ability to shut a door and keep moving as if the last room never existed. With the pan hot enough, my mother took an egg from the carton to start making breakfast. She paused, an odd look on her face, and turned the egg over a few times as if weighing it. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't hear me, shaking the egg once, twice. She cracked it against the lip of the pan, and it sounded wrong somehow, far too brittle. Then she pushed her thumbs into the cracks and spread the egg open in one movement. It was empty. No yolk, no whites, nothing but emptiness. Placing the empty shell to the side, she grabbed for another egg, but again by her expression I could tell it was wrong. She cracked it against the pan, and again it came up empty. She grabbed another, but she didn't bother cracking it against the pan this time, just crushed it in her palm, the sound of dry crackling filling her hand. One after the other she crushed the eggs, finding not a single usable one among them. Without any warning, she threw the last one down, then rushed from the kitchen, slamming her bedroom door shut. I sat silently for a few seconds. Then I got up and turned off the stove, moving the pan away from the heat. As the oil cooled, I threw out the empty shells and cleaned up all the scattered pieces I could find, including those that had fallen to the floor. They were hollow shells, everyone, just like us. Our house was small, tiny even, and when things were going bad, it felt even smaller. Like a belt squeezing around my neck, tightening down on my throat until my lungs burned. With my father and sister gone, and my mother crying softly in her room, I needed some air. Our backyard was nothing more than a worn-out deck, overlooking a patch of crabgrass and dead tree roots. But it did have one thing going for it. trees. The far end of our backyard ended at the start of a wooded area, maybe 9 or 10 acres across, that as far as I was aware didn't belong to anyone. That meant I had free reign over it. I could explore it as much as I wanted without risk of getting in trouble, other than obviously my father. Frankly, he didn't care what I got up to in there, so long as I re-emerged clean and without any new holes in my clothes. And so, needing to get my mind off of whatever was happening in the house that day, I crossed the backyard and entered into the woods. It was a noisy kind of quiet to be found in there, with the sounds of birds and bugs and soft dirt underfoot drowning out the nearby traffic. I must have spent 2 hours stomping around in those woods, breaking branches, poking salamanders, climbing trees, though without a watch on, I had no way of knowing. It was a place where time seemed to lose all meaning. If not for my t-shirt and sneakers, I could have been a kid from any time in history. A pilgrim foraging for berries. The son of a Civil War doctor, sent to locate an herb for a poultice. A hippie child communing with nature. Anything but what I really was. A 6th grader, hiding from his broken family. No matter how much I climbed and prodded and explored those woods, though, there was one area I never entered. Not since the first time I found it. It was cold and dark, and I didn't like the feel of it at all. Like something old lived there. So I avoided it, denied it even existed. I was my mother's son, after all. Eventually, my father and Addie got home. By then, my mother had come out of her room and finished tidying the kitchen to my father's standards. She hadn't looked like she wanted to talk, so I sat on the couch and read. Addie was quiet, not her usual bubbling fountain of words. My father spoke to my mother quietly, and I tried to listen in, but I couldn't make out a word of what they were talking about, only that it was serious. I knew my father would be watching me closely, so I didn't bother trying to ask Addie about the night before. Not until after dinner, when my mother and father were watching television. Addie was playing in her room, close to the door, not on her bed like she usually did. The shades on the window were still pulled down all the way. A pile of paper was spread out in front of her on the floor, and she was scribbling on them with crayons. "Hey," I whispered. "What happened?" Addie didn't look up from her drawing, continuing to make big circles with the black crayon. "I had a bad dream from watching too much television," she said, sounding rehearsed. I could practically hear my father's voice in her words. "Last night you said it wasn't a dream." I got confused. I had just woke up. She grabbed the red crayon, still not looking at me. I could see she wasn't going to say anything to me under threat of my father, so I decided to try something. It wasn't right, and I knew it, but I had to get the truth out of her if I was going to protect her. "Okay, whatever. I think it's gonna rain tonight," I said, pretending to change the subject. "Mm-hmm," she agreed, making big swoops on the paper with the red crayon. I moved across her room and toward the window. "I know you like listening to the rain when you sleep," I said, pulling on the shades. "I'll open this so you can hear it." "No, no, no!" Addie shouted, her whole body twisting toward me. She looked as if she was going to claw me away from the window. Instead, she clutched her mouth shut, realizing how loud she'd been. We both waited a moment, full of the usual dread. Sure enough. "What's going on in there?" Our father called out from the couch. Addie rushed to the doorway to answer him. "Sorry, I broke my crayon," she replied. It was scary how good we'd both gotten at hiding things from our father, anything to avoid his wrath. We both waited a heart-pounding second to see if he believed her story. "Be careful, those things cost money," he said, not moving from the couch. Addie apologized again, and then we both took a breath. I apologized as well to Addie for almost bringing our father down on both our heads, but she didn't want to hear it. She gave me a look I'd never seen on her face before. It was cold and angry, and for the first time I could think of, she looked like my father. I left her room without touching or saying anything else. Before I did, I tried to glance at the stack of drawings she'd been making. She saw me looking and covered them up before I could see. That night, I stayed up for hours, listening. My door cracked slightly to hear better. At first, it was the sound of my parents talking, mostly about money, but eventually they went off to their bedroom and our small house went quiet. I forced myself not to fall asleep so I could run to Addie's room at the first sign of trouble. I would get there first, before my parents did, to see what had Addie so scared. See it with my own eyes before they had a chance to shut me out. Sometime before midnight, the rain started. At first, it was just the pittering of raindrops against the window, a lullaby sound I had to fight to stay awake. But soon it turned. The rain grew bitter, and the wind shook the shutters. The old house creaked and groaned under heavy gusts. As angry as the storm sounded, it had a song-like quality that eventually coaxed my eyelids to shut. I was woken not by screaming, but by wind on my face. It was an odd feeling, like someone was leaned over my bed and whispering to me, their breath as cold as the grave. I gasped and sat up straight in bed. My chest was tight, arms shivering. It was even stranger, given it was summer, but then I remembered the storm and how quickly the temperature dropped once the rain started. That still didn't explain why I was feeling it, though. Once my eyes adjusted to the dark, I noticed the door to my room had swung wide open, swaying in the unnatural wind. I stumbled out of bed, the wood floor a shock of cold under bare skin. The wind whistled through the open doorway, and more than anything, I wanted to shut the door, put on warm clothes, get back into bed, and pull the covers over my head. But a strange fascination drew me forward. It would be impossible to fall back asleep with something so strange going on, of course. But there was something even more important than that. Addie. Addie and the window that had her so terrified I couldn't even touch it. I ran down the cold hallway and toward Addie's room, the wind going right through me, visions of her open window dancing in my mind, rain blasting in through the soaked frame, the violent night sky, and the storm itself, one finger extended, beckoning me to come closer, begging me to join it in the night. But what I found was so much worse. The wind, trapped at the dead end, whipped through Addie's room, creating a cyclone of tumbling and twirling papers. I had to shield my face or risk paper cuts. Her window was still shut tight, the lock at the bottom clasped, but the shades had been raised to the top. The pane was wet from rain, and it was fogged up as if someone had been breathing against the glass from the outside. Raindrops threw themselves against the window, and flashes of lightning popped and jumped in the distance, lighting up the violent night. But all that wasn't even close to the worst part. The worst part was the bed, with Addie not in it. My heart felt like a stone lodged in my trachea. Addie's bed, empty, the sheets thrown aside, was everything I'd been afraid of, everything I'd tried to avoid with my acting out and my standing between her and my father. Yet in doing so, I dropped my guard against all else, every threat that came from outside rather than in. Something slapped against my leg. I jumped, picturing bony fingers clasped around my ankle, eager to drag me away. I grasped desperately at whatever it was, ready to fight for my life, and came back with a sheet of paper. It was one of Addie's drawings, and it was a face. It had a round, misshapen head, with the tiniest of eyes at the center, and beneath them, the longest, widest mouth I'd ever seen. The smile was practically carved into the paper in red crayon. The paper flapped violently from the wind, causing the face to seem alive in my hands. I looked around then, at the papers flying around me. They were simple, crude, even, but everyone was of the exact same thing, a smiling face. It was a tornado of grotesque faces, all of them grinning and laughing at me. The sight of those sickly smiling faces brought the last minute or so into terrible focus. I knew then where the wind was coming from, and why. Worse, I knew where Addie had gone. I ran then, ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, back up the wind tunnel of a hallway, past my room, through the living room, and to the front of the house. The entire way there, I prayed not to find what I thought I would, and yet there was no doubt in my mind. I could see it so clearly, the culmination of 1,000 nightmares, and even then, when I saw it with my own eyes, the actual image of it caused the nightmares to pale and wither under its power. The front door, unlocked from the inside, swung wide open to the wind and rain, and Addie, little Addie, was long gone. I don't remember running outside, and I don't remember searching for her in the woods, screaming into the thunder. I only know that my parents found me on the ground, in the mud, calling out Addie's name with what was left of my voice. I had a waterlogged ball of paper clenched so tightly in my hand that it took the two of them to pry it from my fist. When they finally did, and they managed to unwrap and uncurl the wet, gummy mess enough to look at it, the face at its center smiled at them too.
Story 2. Nearly 500,000 children are reported missing each year in the United States. Averaged out across all of the cities, towns, and the like, that comes out to about 4 missing kids per populated area per year. Fortunately, all but a tiny handful, about 12,000, or 1 for every 9 towns, turn up unharmed, and only 0.01%, or about 1 kid every 2,160 towns, is found murdered. Averages are great for breaking big statistics down into numbers that are easier to understand. But obviously, nothing really works that way. More kids go missing in Texas than in the other states, for example, while almost none go missing in South Dakota. More children are found safely in New York than almost anywhere else. And in the small town of Dorton Bluffs, not one missing child has ever been found alive. They lose their 4 per year pretty regularly. There's almost never been a year where at least 2 didn't disappear. 2015 was particularly bad, and 10 kids went missing. The police records for the town only go back to 1996, when a fire burned down the station one night. But the memories of the families there go back a lot longer. Children who vanish in Dorton Bluffs are rarely seen again. Those who are discovered, for the most part, the families wish they hadn't been. Statistical improbabilities happen, of course. However, to the eyes of Felix Freeman, an investigator in the FBI's Child Abduction and Serial Killer Unit, these disappearances had all of the hallmarks of an uncaught killer. The victims were all teenagers or younger, with most being between 12 and 16. The town was in a remote geographic area with plenty of unoccupied land. And most interestingly, they seemed to happen around the same 2 times each year, right at the beginning of both spring and fall. Even in the years where more children went missing, they disappeared in 2 small clusters around those dates. This reeked of ritual to Felix. After months of badgering his superiors, he wrangled the funding for an exploratory trip to the region. To his mind, it was an open and shut case. The question was not whether the abductions were happening. That, he felt, was entirely certain. All he needed was proof of the culprit. Whoever was behind this was responsible for hundreds of disappearances, making him the most prolific serial killer ever found. If, of course, Felix could find him. He was positive he could. Felix had had the profile built long before he had ever submitted his request for funding. He was looking for a man, likely in his 70s at this point, someone born and raised in Dorton Bluffs, but who had not been popular as a teen. He was an only child, or a significantly younger sibling, 10 years or more. His mother had died when he was no more than 5 years old. He had probably never married, and almost certainly never had any children. His schooling had stopped at high school. He did not travel. He was probably a farmer. Felix had requested funding for 2 weeks' worth of travel, but in all honesty, he expected it to take only 3 days. 1 to search through the town's census and land records to determine his suspect, 1 to convince a local judge to issue a warrant, and 1 to unearth the trophies that the man had doubtless kept from each of his killings. If Dorton Bluffs had bothered to digitize any of their records, he could probably have found a name for his suspect and gotten a warrant before ever setting foot in the town. Then again, if they were the sort of place inclined to modernize, they would never have had a serial killer like this in their midst in the first place. His intent had been to keep a low profile. It was very likely that the killer kept an eye on any activity in town, though probably from a distance. his victims were taken too regularly to simply be crimes of convenience, which meant that he had to observe and plan. A stranger in town would already be something of note, one who was blatantly asking questions designed to find someone matching the killer's description would tip him off immediately. When Felix walked into the courthouse and asked to see the archivist, though, the woman at the counter cast a jaded eye over him and said, "Here to find out about the missing kids?" Felix was completely taken aback. What do you mean?" "It's the start of disappearing season. That's when your sort usually turns up wanting to go through the records." "I can't. You have a name for it." The woman shrugged. "Course we do. Town's got a situation like ours. It's bound to get a name." "And what? You just let it happen? What do you want us to do about it?" Felix was baffled by her unconcern. "Anything. Catch the guy. Stop whoever's preying on the kids in your town." "There's no guy, mister. The kids who vanish, they weren't ever happy here. Not a whole lot to offer a certain kind of person out here. We don't have big malls and fancy theaters and high-tech living. Even Walmart's more than an hour away." "So you're saying that they just run away?" Felix stared at her in disbelief. "Every single year, something like a half-dozen kids just pack up and start walking, and not one of them ever comes back. It's what do they call it now? A meme? It lives in their heads. Things aren't going so well at home. They start thinking about how Jim or Mark or Andrew was talking last year about something similar, and about how they took a hike. They think about how it must have worked out, and how their friend's probably living it up in the big city right now. They picture themselves in a big apartment, flashing cash around, and doing all the things a small town just won't let you do." "And that's what you think has happened?" She scoffed. "Nah, I've seen the city. I think they're all crammed into tiny rat-hole apartments with a couple of roommates, working some minimum wage job that barely lets them survive. But the kind of person who runs away from here to prove that they know better, they can't come back with their tail tucked between their legs. They gave this town a big middle finger and said that they could do better, and they can't take the shame of admitting they were wrong. They must have been, though. If any of them had made it, you can bet they'd have been right back through here, waving that money around to show us all what we were missing. And it never occurred to you that you might be wrong? That something might have been happening to these kids, and you could have helped them if only you'd looked? Someone like you comes by every so often, saying something pretty much like that. They dig into it for a few days, and then wander off. None of them have ever stopped back by to let me know what they've learned. I'm guessing you won't either, and I'm guessing it's for the same reason those kids never came back. Too embarrassed to admit that you were the one who was wrong." Felix shook his head. "I suppose we'll see." Downstairs, the archivist brought Felix the records he requested without comment, but something in his body language gave Felix the impression that he felt the same as the lady at the front desk. Perhaps it was the way he dropped off the stack of books, or the manner in which he turned away immediately afterward. It may have simply been his total lack of curiosity about why Felix wanted the documents. Whatever the cause, Felix was sure that the archivist expected him to look into the matter, conclude that for decades, children had simply been wandering off and slink back to DC. For a moment, Felix even wondered if he might be correct. He had thought that it was strange that he was the first one to notice the pattern here, and if it turned out that others had investigated and found nothing, then perhaps he really was barking up the wrong tree. He shook the thought off. The evidence was too strong. This sort of thing didn't happen anywhere else in America. It was only Dorton Bluffs. Something was going on here, even if the people in town didn't want to believe it. And who could blame them? Who would want to believe that the worst serial killer ever found had been operating nearby for decades? People in places like Dorton Bluffs like to describe their towns as peaceful or calm or even sleepy. They didn't want to consider the idea that horrific murders had been occurring multiple times a year for their entire lives. It would upend their entire worldview of their quiet community. It would make them question their own status as good people, having done nothing about it. Felix didn't blame them. Not really. It was possible to be too close to something to see how screwed up it was. Most of them had grown up with this acceptance of the biannual disappearances being the way things were. Anything could seem normal if you were raised to expect it. The land records gave Felix a listing of who lived on the outskirts of the community. He was able to cross off quite a few immediately due to the title being in multiple people's names, as he was looking for a lifetime loner. The census narrowed it down still further, providing him with ages and identifying who had siblings, partners, and families. At the end of the day, Felix was left with a list of 4 good suspects. It wasn't quite the absolute certainty he'd told himself he would have on day 1, but it was close. A few questions around town tomorrow would reveal which one it was, he was sure. Even if folks said that nothing was going on, people always had opinions on who the weird ones were, especially in a small town like this. As he was walking back to the hotel, he was nearly knocked over by a crowd of laughing children scampering by him along the sidewalk. He watched them scatter down alleys and behind buildings, their noise quieting as they separated. Up ahead, a young girl with her eyes closed was being spun in circles by a boy only slightly older, who was chanting, standing in the forest, still as a tree, hiding up high where nobody can see, snatching up a baby, quick as can be. Treetops, treetops, don't eat me. When he finished the rhyme, her eyes popped open, and she ran off down the street in pursuit of the others, laughing as she staggered back and forth from the dizziness. Felix heard shrieks of glee and triumph from behind him as she found one after another of her hidden friends. He smiled and continued on his way. It was good to see that no matter what else was going on in the town, children were the same everywhere. The next morning, Felix went to a nearby diner in hopes of finding some locals to engage in casual conversation at the dining counter. He thought he might pose as a land developer looking to buy one of the farms on the edge of town, see if he could draw out some thoughts on the men who owned the places. To his surprise, his attempts immediately ran into the same shrewd awareness he had encountered at the courthouse. "Hi, I'm new in town, just been taking a bit of a look around. I was thinking I might buy a piece of land around here. Do you know anything about..." He consulted a notebook for the look of things, though he knew the names and addresses of each man he wanted to ask about. "John Simmons, out on County Road 115? The man next to him at the counter fixed him with a look. "You looking to bother him about the runaways?" Felix acted confused while trying to recover. "Sorry, the what? Did he have runaways on his farm?" The man snorted. "Mister, you may think I'm stupid, but I don't think I'm stupid. If you want an answer to the question you asked, no, John won't sell. If you want to talk about what you were going to spend 20 minutes hinting around at, instead, we can skip to that part if you like." So you're aware of the disappearances, if you want to call them that. Folks disappear off to the big city every day. It's got a lot to offer a certain type of person. But these are kids, farm kids mainly. Been doing hard manual labor since they were old enough to lift a pail. Working a sandwich shop sounds to some of them like it might be a nice break. Did you know that they only vanish at certain times of the year? It's only ever at the start of spring and fall. When did you want them to go? In summer, when it's so hot, even the flies go lie down in the shade? Or in winter, with snow drifting up past a grown man's shoulders? Of course, they go in the nice times a year. The man turned back to his coffee. Look, you don't have to listen to me. Go down to the high school. Ask the kids there. Tommy Finch left last year. Everyone knew him. If they think different from me, they'll let you know. Felix looked around the diner. No one was even pretending not to have been listening. He could tell by their expressions that they were unlikely to give him any other answer than the one he'd just gotten. He sighed and ordered breakfast. The rest of the day was no more fruitful. He tried a few different cover stories at other locations, but met with the same result everywhere. Everyone called him on his bluffs immediately, and although they were perfectly willing to talk to him, every single person gave him the same answer. The kids had just left on their own. Year after year, in defiance of all probability, they had gone looking for a better life in the big city and had never come back. As the afternoon wore on, Felix found himself running low on ideas. He couldn't bring a judge 4 possibilities and ask for a warrant for all of their properties just to find out which one it was. He was tempted to just pick the most likely and hope, but if he guessed wrong, then the murders would continue, and on a more personal level, his credibility and career would take a serious hit. Against his better judgment, Felix headed over to the high school as it was letting out for the day. He tried to figure out a reason for being there that wouldn't sound creepy. After a few rejected ideas, he decided to just bite the bullet and go with the truth. I'm looking into the yearly disappearances of kids. I know Tommy Finch was one of them last year, and he went here. Any of you willing to talk about it? Most of the teens streamed past him without stopping. A few did him the courtesy of shaking their heads to at least show that they'd heard him, but the majority didn't even make eye contact. Just as Felix was giving up, he caught one boy's attention. Hey, you looking for Tommy? The boy was on the younger side, for high school, maybe 14 or 15. 4 other teens had stopped with him. All were eyeing Felix curiously, waiting on his response. Felix didn't want to give the group false hope by implying that Tommy might still be alive, but he also didn't want to lose the first students who'd been willing to talk to him. He chose his words carefully. I'm looking into the disappearances, including his, yeah. I think it's likely that there'll be some more soon. I'm hoping to stop them. Then you're looking for treetops. So you don't think that the kids are simply running away? The boy shook his head. The gesture was echoed by his friends. No. They get out of line, and treetops takes them. Whose treetops? Not who. What? Up in the forest, north of town. That's where they take the offerings. That's where treetops is. Felix was elated. Only one of the farms on his list was up that way. Is it Darren Olson? Is that who takes them? The boy shook his head. Treetops isn't a person. It doesn't matter who takes them. You could arrest anyone in this town and someone else would do it. Treetops is a cult. The idea took Felix's breath away with its enormity. It seemed impossible to believe that an entire town could be complicit in such a thing, but it fit with everything he'd seen so far. In fact, it made significantly more sense than anything else. Felix's heartbeat was suddenly loud in his ears as he considered all of the people he'd spoken to over the last 2 days. By now, everyone in town must know why he was here. He wasn't safe. He had to leave. The boy's voice cut through his burgeoning panic. "I can show you where they take them." Felix hesitated, considering. Spending any more time here was a risk. On the other hand, fleeing empty-handed because a teenager had fed him a story about the entire town being a death cult wasn't going to play well with his superiors. It all made sense, but Felix had no proof. If the boy could show him something in the woods, he could bring back concrete proof instead of just a bad feeling. All right. Suddenly it occurred to Felix that going to the woods outnumbered 4-1 might be a mistake. But just you. I'm not getting in your car alone, man. Me and Carl. Neither boy came up past Felix's chin, and he had his gun besides. All right, let's go now before it gets dark. Paved roads gave way to dirt roads, which quickly led to a rutted, weed-covered path closed off by a chain with a no trespassing sign hanging from it. Carl got out of the car to unhook the chain. Devin, which Felix had learned was the first boy's name, leaned up from the back seat. "We're gonna go down here about a 1/4 mile. Go slow, 'cause some of these ruts will rip the bottom right off of your car if you're not careful. The road's gonna end in a little clearing, and then we'll walk from there." Felix eyed the tree line. "How long a walk?" "Half an hour, maybe. Less if you've got a good pace. Plenty of time to get in and back out while it's still light." The path ended in a space just big enough to turn a car around, as Devin had said. Felix climbed out of the car and followed the 2 boys into the woods. They walked with purpose, which he took to be a good sign. The idea that this was all a prank, or worse, was still at the front of his mind. "So, how long has Treetops been going on?" Felix asked. "Longer than anyone here," said Devin. "What happens to people who don't join? Treetops happens to them. Aren't you worried about them finding out that you've told me all of this?" "Nah," said Devin. "Treetops will take care of that." Abruptly, the 2 boys sprinted off in different directions. Felix cursed and grabbed for his gun as he took off after Carl, who seemed to be slightly slower. The teen's smaller size was an advantage in the woods, however, and Felix rapidly lost sight of him as he vanished into the trees. Felix stopped, caught his breath, and assessed his situation. He didn't know precisely where he was, but he knew roughly which direction they'd come from and how long they'd walked. Even if he missed the car, he was bound to come across the road, and he could find his way back from there. He began walking back in the direction of the car. After a few feet, Felix heard a faint, intermittent rustling from somewhere behind him. He kept walking as if he had heard nothing, but focused his attention and waited for the sound to repeat. A few steps later, it came again. It was a gentle rustling of the underbrush, the sort that might have been caused by an animal or even the wind. It was coming from only a short way behind him, though, and it seemed to be moving in his direction. Felix continued onward until he heard the noise once more, then whipped around, gun drawn. He expected to see the scared faces of one or both of the teens, or at least their backs as they ran from him, but was surprised to see nothing behind him but vines and trees. One of the trunks suddenly moved, sweeping toward him in a huge, ground-eating step. It traveled through the air with barely a whisper and landed with nothing more than a slight rustle of the brush beneath it. Felix looked up in disbelief to see a titanic, gangly hand descending for him. Each gnarled finger was as long as his body, and the arm beyond them was the size of an oak. It moved with terrifying swiftness and almost total silence. Felix fired his gun directly into the onrushing palm, but it had no more effect than throwing a pebble against a train. He ducked and ran as the fingers swiped overhead, clenching into a fist just where he had been standing. Roots, vines, and branches clutched at Felix as he ran. The forest itself seemed determined to stop him, though it offered no such impediment to the gigantic thing at his heels. Over and over again he heard the frightening whisper of its footfalls, felt the threatening breeze of its grasp. He dodged back and forth, scoring his face and arms with 1,000 small cuts, desperately fleeing for safety. Sunlight glinted on metal, and Felix recognized his rental car. He was almost back to the clearing. He put on a final burst of speed and tore from the trees, sprinting for the car. He grabbed the door handle, only to find it locked. As he grabbed for the key in his pocket, fingers as hard as stone wrapped around him and lifted him effortlessly from the ground. Felix shrieked as he was carried up into the trees, the car vanishing beneath him. He struggled and kicked, but the grip around his body was implacable. Enormous steps carried him swiftly back into the forest, the tops of the trees brushing rapidly by his trapped body. The green of the pine needles surrounding him was suddenly broken by swaths of white. In horror, Felix realized that the upper branches were decorated with thousands of bones, rib cages, and hip bones, and skulls. The grisly ornaments stretched as far as he could see in any direction, a gruesome aerial graveyard. Felix opened his mouth to scream again. The hand holding him tightened only once. There was a sudden, brutal crunch. After that was silence, except for a quiet, steady dripping. Felix continued onward until he heard the noise once more, then whipped around, gun drawn. He expected to see the scared faces of one or both of the teens, or at least their backs as they ran from him, but was surprised to see nothing behind him but vines and trees. One of the trunks suddenly moved, sweeping toward him in a huge, ground-eating step. It traveled through the air with barely a whisper and landed with nothing more than a slight rustle of the brush beneath it. Felix looked up in disbelief to see a titanic, gangly hand descending for him. Each gnarled finger was as long as his body, and the arm beyond them was the size of an oak. It moved with terrifying swiftness and almost total silence. Felix fired his gun directly into the onrushing palm, but it had no more effect than throwing a pebble against a train. He ducked and ran as the fingers swiped overhead, clenching into a fist just where he had been standing. Roots, vines, and branches clutched at Felix as he ran. The forest itself seemed determined to stop him, though it offered no such impediment to the gigantic thing at his heels. Over and over again he heard the frightening whisper of its footfalls, felt the threatening breeze of its grasp. He dodged back and forth, scoring his face and arms with 1,000 small cuts, desperately fleeing for safety. Sunlight glinted on metal, and Felix recognized his rental car. He was almost back to the clearing. He put on a final burst of speed and tore from the trees, sprinting for the car. He grabbed the door handle, only to find it locked. As he grabbed for the key in his pocket, fingers as hard as stone wrapped around him and lifted him effortlessly from the ground. Felix shrieked as he was carried up into the trees, the car vanishing beneath him. He struggled and kicked, but the grip around his body was implacable. Enormous steps carried him swiftly back into the forest, the tops of the trees brushing rapidly by his trapped body. The green of the pine needles surrounding him was suddenly broken by swaths of white. In horror, Felix realized that the upper branches were decorated with thousands of bones, rib cages, and hip bones, and skulls. The grisly ornaments stretched as far as he could see in any direction, a gruesome aerial graveyard. Felix opened his mouth to scream again. The hand holding him tightened only once. There was a sudden, brutal crunch. After that was silence, except for a quiet, steady dripping. "He almost made it out," Carl said. He and Devin were back at the clearing, hiding behind a small earthen hill on the far side. "Good thing for us he didn't," said Devin. "You think he deserved it?" Devin shrugged. "Could be. You think any of us deserve it?" "Well, they pick the ones who act out." "Sure, if you believe that. You think you've been good enough that they couldn't find a reason to feed you to treetops? Better him than us. It was always a good year when someone came from the outside. Treetops was happy to eat strangers, and they could spare their own.